for mesh optimization and stability improvement of finite volume simulations. I hope you hear me all right. I've also have not been feeling very well for the past few days with a very bad sore throat, so I apologize for the harsh voice. My name is Mohammad. This project is a collaboration for my PhD with Professor Carl Oliver Gooch at the University of British Columbia. We have a few interesting topics as they just mentioned. So they're already published, and some of them are going to be published soon. So everyone is welcome to go ahead and read them. But today I will give you an overview of what we've been doing and the most recent 2 papers that we've published. So let me see. So the content of my presentation are going to be an introduction of my approach, the approach itself, and the primary results for our original approach. Then I will talk about a few issues with that approach and how we address those using residual vector analysis and machine learning. And then the results for the secondary approach, and then my future plans. So I would like to quickly go over my flow simulation method. If we consider an arbitrary conservative dependent variable u, which is a function of time and a vector of independent variables x, we can write a conservation of u as equation 1. In this equation, big F is the flux vector and the small f is the source term. In finite volume methods, we integrate the differential equations in divergence form over control volumes. Then with the application of Gauss's theorem, the volume integration is converted into surface integrals across the boundaries, which result in equation 2, in which Vi shows cell I, N is the unit outward pointing vector from each face, and R is the residual vector, and U bar are the average conservative property inside each cell. We can apply Crank-Nicolson time-stepping integration method, time-stepping method, as presented in equation 3. And then we can linearize to get equation 4. In this equation, partial R over partial U is the Jacobian matrix, and we will work with this for a few slides. We can find the Jacobian using finite differences or chain rule differentiation. So according to the Lyapunov stability theory, the real part of an eigenmode shows the magnitude growth rate, and imaginary part shows the oscillatory behavior. Here we have an example linear system. The eigenvalues are shown with blue circles. As you can see, the values on the right side and the response is shown in a gray box. As you can see, the values on the right side have a diverging behavior and unstable, while the values on the left side have a converging behavior. Also increasing the imaginary part increases the oscillations and or frequency in the response. So here's Berger's the 2 Berger's problems as an example. On the left side, you see the eigenspectrum of the 2 problems. So for problem 1, we have black squares, and for this problem, we have a single unstable mode on the right side, so positive real part. And the residual history on the right side of your screen shows problem 1 is unstable, as shown with a solid black line. But then the problem, the second problem doesn't have that unstable mode in its eigenspectrum, and residual history shows that the problem is converging. Okay, so we can formulate changes in a given vector of independent variables that affect the Jacobian matrix for improved stability. An example of independent variables that work well are the vertex locations. As a result, we can change vertex location for favorable changes in those unstable modes. Or in other words, we can modify the mesh to push these unstable modes to the left side to make the problem stable, basically. Also, other properties such as the physics, boundary conditions, reconstruction, and so on also have a considerable effect on the Jacobian matrix, but I focus on the mesh itself.
Mohammad, I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, this the eigenvalues are the eigenvalues of the Jacobian matrix, correct?
Yes.
So this divergence and the convergence of this residual, but these are nonlinear residuals, correct?
Could you please repeat that? What residuals?
I think you were talking about stability of the linear system.
Yes.
So I need to do this. So if you go back to the previous slide, another one.
Another one?
The beginning. This one. So equation 4. You are talking about the eigenvalue of this left-hand side big matrix.
Yes, this one.
So if this matrix eigenvalue is negative, does it guarantee this nonlinear convergence, nonlinear residual convergence to be stable? I thought you were talking about the linear.
Yeah, that's a good question. So right now I'm thinking, because we were discussing this a long time ago with my supervisor as well, with Carl. But let's put it this way: if we have unstable modes in this eigenspectrum, it's still possible that it is stable, a stable convergence. Okay. I'm not sure if it works the other way, but it doesn't guarantee the instability if we have unstable values. It's just a proxy. It shows us that there might be something wrong, and we can, remediate them.
Okay.
So Mohammad, if I remember correctly, the requirement that the space discretization has eigenvalues with negative real parts is sufficient but not necessary for the system of ODEs to be stable. But as you say, the details of the time advance scheme can change what region of the complex plane is actually stable for your time advance scheme. And so you could have eigenvalues in the right half plane that are stable because, say, you're using implicit Euler.
That is correct. Yes. Thank you, Carl.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So, right. So, if we go over the prerequisites of our approach, to start, we need to perform eigenanalysis on the Jacobian matrix. The matrix doesn't have to be explicitly defined. Only implicit representation is enough, which are called matrix-free methods. Equation 5 and 6 show the standard right and left eigenproblems in which x and y are the right and left eigenvectors, and lambda is the eigenvalue. We utilize LabC library for the solution to our eigenproblems. We also use spectral transformation to isolate the regions that are more interesting to us because we focus on the eigenvalues with positive real parts. And we don't really have to focus on the other ones usually. So that's for computational, resources. The next step would be to identify proper vertices in the mesh for modification. According to our experiments, the unstable numerical modes are highly local to certain areas in the solution. In other words, large changes in each unstable mode are expected with changes in a small selection of vertices on the mesh. To show this, I've presented the contours of the gradients of an eigenvalue in the solution to an Euler problem. It's NACA 0015 the airfoil. In both plots, we see the gradients are highly localized to a certain vertex near the top surface. Also, you should notice the log scale on the color map, which shows the value quickly bleeds to 0 as we go further away to the yellow region. This example eigenmode is around, has a real part of around 0.96, and the gradient in with respect to x is around 200, and with respect to y is around 1000. As a result, with very small changes to this vertex location, we expect substantial changes in this particular eigenvalue. In this approach, we select a single vertex for modification to stabilize each of these unstable modes. Here we see a Berger's problem in a rectangular channel, which includes a single unstable mode in its eigenspectrum. On the left plot, I've shown the absolute value of the eigenvector in each cell. And then I go around, take every vertex and add up the value inside the adjacent cells for that vertex. And that gives us the plot on the right. This is a measure of vertex selection for us. We choose the vertex that has the highest value, here shown with a white circle. This is to, because choosing the vertex essentially is finding the gradients of the eigenvalue and choosing the vertex with the highest gradient, but that is computationally expensive and we would like to avoid that. So this method is what we presented, and it has proved to identify the vertex with the largest gradient, at least in experiment. In the next step, we need to calculate the eigenvalue gradient with respect to the movement of those particular vertices. Two methods might be used. In the direct method, we can use finite differences. However, you will need the solution of the eigenproblem multiple times, which is not ideal. Eigensolution is very computationally expensive. In the indirect method, we use the left and right eigenvectors along with the gradient of the Jacobian itself, as presented in equation 7. Here, only one solution to the eigenproblem is enough. On the other hand, changes to a small selection of vertices affect only a small number of rows in the Jacobian. So you don't even have to recompute the full Jacobian. Only those rows are enough. Yeah, so the next step, of course, would be to use our calculations to perform mesh optimization and mesh modification. We use a Taylor series expansion as equation 9 for this reason. The old eigenvalues are pushed to a new goal eigenvalue, which is usually as far to the left side of the spectrum as possible. We want these eigenmodes to not be dominant modes in the solution anymore. In my approach, most unstable modes are remediated with a single movement of the vertex. Although attention should be paid to cases where the vertex is part of a cell with high aspect ratio, such as in turbulent problems. However, in my new tests, we've shown that the gradient is very large compared to the limits imposed on the vertex movement, which is good for us. So here's the overall optimization approach. In one nonlinear solution iteration, the user decides to perform the optimization or not. This is one of the drawbacks, as I will mention in a second. So this requires human decision. Then we compute the Jacobian. I perform eigenanalysis, find the vertices for modification, find movement vectors, and then perform the mesh optimization. One of the issues, as I just mentioned, that still remains is the requirement for human decision. Virtual unstable modes, due to the initial conditions, show up in the eigenspectrum, which don't require any special treatment, as they will die out automatically. I thought I heard someone have a question. So if you have a question, you can just go right ahead and cut me off. Don't worry about it. So yeah, that's why we don't recommend performing the optimization in the first iteration of the solver, because that would be extra work. The next issue with this methodology is the requirement for full eigenanalysis of the Jacobian, or at least partially, which makes it infeasible for large-scale problems. But if we put these issues aside for a second, I would like to present some results on this approach.
That's a good question.
Sure, go ahead.
I just want to understand this algorithm here. So when the solver is not converged, now you go to, you're going to do optimization, and you compute Jacobian. But you already computed Jacobian here, the linear solver, right?
So
do you have to compute again?
So we don't have to compute it. I just copied this from my first paper. But only an implicit representation is enough. And in fact, in most solvers, they don't compute the Jacobian because it's just too expensive to deal with computationally. So there are different methods to find Jacobian times a given vector. Okay, we don't need the Jacobian itself. We just need the multiplication of the Jacobian with a given vector. And there are methods for that, implicit methods. In our solver, we can ask for the Jacobian explicitly, but in most solvers, I know it's not explicitly defined.
So you don't have Jacobian here in the linear solver, and you don't have Jacobian here also. Right? You don't explicitly compute and store Jacobian here and here.
Yeah, so I do explicitly find it, but it's not required. Okay, it's possible.
So you can compute eigenvalues and eigenvectors without explicitly computing Jacobian. And that's what you need, right? Eigenvalues and eigenvectors. And then you identify how many vertices are you going to choose here? Just one?
So at least one for each unstable mode, but each vertex can stabilize multiple unstable modes. Yeah.
Okay.
But Jacobian itself, we only need the implicit representation, which means we need a function that gives us the multiplication of the Jacobian, that matrix, with a given vector. That's the only thing that's required for this method.
And then you move this the vertex location. And here some iterations are required here, or just one movement, and then.
In our previous approach, original approach, multiple iterations were required. But what we did was eliminate that and just push the eigenvalue as far to the left as possible, because we have limits on vertex movement, of course, to prevent mesh tangling. And then this new method proved to be working very well, and it just does it in one iteration.
So after mesh modification, they're all positive eigenvalues will be gone, and then you come back to the noise. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, usually, not always. Sometimes when we push those unstable modes to the left side, some new ones show up. Because we call this opposing eigenmodes. We're moving one vertex, not only stabilize some unstable ones, but destabilizes some of the other ones. And we also presented a method to fix those as well.
Thank you.
So here on the subject of computing the Jacobian, even if you have to do that in extra time, that is so cheap compared to the eigensolve that you probably don't care.
Okay.
In this variant, the eigensolve is an order of magnitude slower than everything else, or close to it.
Thank you.
That's correct. Thank you. So if we look at some of the results for this original approach, this is a Beggars problem with 500 cells. I use Crank-Nicolson time stepping. The original mesh is presented in black on the right side of your screen. The original Jacobian included one unstable mode, as you can see on the left side of your screen in the eigenspectrum. Given with black squares, there's one mode on the right side of the spectrum. And residual history shows it's diverging. We apply our method at iteration 10 of the solver, and nonlinear iteration 10 results in the movement of a single vertex, which is this new red mesh. It's a small movement. The eigenspectrum shows there are no unstable modes anymore, and residual history shows a converging result. This is a 3D advection problem with 800 cells, again using Crank-Nicolson time stepping. This time, again, we have one single unstable mode in the eigenspectrum. For the first try, we just took this single unstable mode and pushed it to the left side, which gave us the blue eigenspectrum and the blue residual history, which is stable but slow converging. The reason for this slow convergence is it's a stable result. However, if you look at the eigenspectrum, the blue one, there's a single mode that is very close to zero. It's on the negative side, the real parts, but it's very close to zero. So that's the slow converging mode. So we just restarted our approach, and this time took the two largest modes. One of them is unstable, the other one is stable, and pushed those two to the left, as far to the left as possible. And that gave us the red eigenspectrum and the red residual history, which is much faster converging. And so this shows that this method can also be used to improve convergence rate, not only for stability, to get stability. Here's an Euler problem, this time using implicit Euler time stepping. Our solver uses local time stepping as well as CFL evolution. So when the residual is trying to go up, we reduce the time step to prevent instabilities right away. And when the residual goes down, we just increase the time step for faster convergence. The original problem on this black mesh, this is NACA 0015, by the way. And the black mesh was unstable, as you can see in the residual history. We applied our method. 2 vertices were moved to the red mesh, and the red residual history shows fast convergence, 10 to the minus 10 residual in 7 iterations, which is very good. So this is a larger Euler problem using implicit Euler again. This time it's around 30,000 cells, so that's 120,000 degrees of freedom. 2 iterations of our optimization were required this time. The first iteration gives us this blue mesh, which doesn't show well enough, but on the middle plot, it's right here near the top surface. And the second iteration of our optimization gave us the red mesh, as you can see on the right side, it's near the leading edge. And this resulted in a converging residual, converging problem, as you can see on the left residual history. So yeah, let's go back to the issues that we had with this original approach and try to fix them. The 2 major drawbacks were the manual optimization and the need for eigenanalysis. Firstly, we want as little human intervention as possible. Further, to replace the eigenanalysis, which is the most computationally intensive aspect, we need to find new means of vertex selection and movement vector calculation. We were able to use machine learning and anomaly detection on the residual vector to satisfy these goals. Here's Berger's problem. It's divergent. It's on a rectangular channel. As you can see on the left plot, the iteration 12 is the onset of instabilities. It's starting to diverge. And the contour on the right shows the residual in individual cells, which shows there are a few outlier values in this residual at this particular iteration. And that is the unstable mode showing itself in the residual. We were able to use this information to find growing anomalies and to turn on the mesh optimization, which I will expand a little bit. The bottom, here's another Berger's problem. The bottom plot shows the L2 norm of the residual, and the top plot shows the residual in individual cells. So each color is a cell, and then the plot shows the history of the residual in each cell. So here, if you look at iteration 10,
one interesting thing, which I don't really understand or agree on, when he showed the Schlieren there, first it enters, then it kind of disappears, and then it re-enters. And he said that was the hot temperature oxidation.
He said the re-entering is the.
Okay, I think that was not a question for me, but it's okay. So at iteration 10, we have the onset of instabilities. And as you can see, if you look at the top plot, at this iteration 10, most cells are showing a converging residual, while some cells are showing diverging results, diverging residual. So those are outliers in the residual vector. Okay. Here's an Euler problem, again with Crank-Nicolson. It's an unstable problem. At around iteration 350, you can see some cells with outlier values of residual. If we have a closer look at this one, I've shown the residual value at iteration 350 on the top plot in individual cells. And again, clearly there are some cells that have anomalous values compared to the other ones. The bottom plot, I've indicated two cells, one of them anomalous, the other one non-anomalous. The red cell is showing an increasing residual, while the black cell is showing a decreasing residual at iteration 350 and going forward. So that's why the red cell is considered an anomalous cell. So we can use machine learning algorithms to find these outliers in the residual. The next issue was to find proper vertices for modification and calculate movement vectors. We need to construct vectors from the residual that resemble and look like the unstable eigenvectors. Our method is to identify the anomalous residual vector and eliminate all the values except for the outliers. We call this a synthetic vector that can be used in finding vertices and to calculate movement vectors. According to our experiments, at the right iteration, this new vector has a high cosine value with the unstable eigenvector. So that means they're looking similar and they point to the same vertex on the mesh for modification, which is good. Also, if we find the gradient using, as you can see in this table, using the eigenvector as well as the synthetic vector for two problems, we get two different gradients. For the Euler problem, at least in this example, the cosine between these two gradients is 95%, and for the Burgers problem is 99%. So again, they're telling us, both vectors are telling us to move in the same direction, or at least similar directions. But a question here is, well, what happens if the two vectors are not 100% similar? The good news is there's a large window for vertex movement. Here's an example Burgers problem. This vertex with white circle, shown with a white circle, I took this vertex and moved it around inside a cell. And for each location of this vertex, find the eigenspectrum and show the real part of the most unstable eigenvalue as a color map here. So if the vertex was on the pink side, the problem was unstable. And if it was on the cyan side, it was stable. Okay, so what this shows us is there's a large window for vertex movement, and we just need to point in the general direction of movement, and we will get a stable result, hopefully. So yeah, that's how we address the two issues with our original approach, and now some of the results of our new approach. Here's a Burgers problem using Crank-Nicolson time stepping. The original problem on the black mesh was unstable. As you can see in the eigenspectrum, there's a single unstable mode. Our new approach and the previous approach, the new approach is red and the previous one is blue, show similar vertex movement and very similar residual histories, both converging. Here's another Burgers problem. This time we have 5 unstable modes, 4 real ones, and a pair of conjugate eigenvalues. This time the new approach, unlike the previous one where we aim for a single optimization iteration, the new approach requires multiple if we have multiple unstable modes. Here, 3 iterations were required. So the first iteration was green, then blue, then red. And then you can see in the residual history how the convergence is attained. we first go to the green residual, it's unstable, then blue, then red. And the right plot shows the vertex movements at each iteration. Another Euler problem with Crank-Nicolson time stepping. The residual history shows, excuse me, both methods also give the same convergence histories, at least very similar. Same Euler problem using implicit Euler time stepping this time for faster convergence. The original problem was unstable, and both methods, blue and red, gave us the similar convergence. Here's an Euler problem with 16,000 cells, this time using implicit Euler time stepping. Again, our new approach moves a single vertex in the mesh near the trailing edge at the bottom surface, which is red. And this iteration gave us a stable result, as you can see. So an important aspect of an important issue for us was the efficiency of our method. Thankfully, eigenanalysis, which was the most resource-intensive aspect from our original approach, is now eliminated in the new approach. Unlike eigenanalysis, residual analysis is not the bottleneck of the computations anymore. As seen here, so you should compare the solid blue line versus the dashed blue line. That's the difference between our previous approach and our new approach. So we completely removed eigenanalysis. And the solid blue line versus the dashed blue line, there is orders 2 to 3 magnitude improvement, which is very good. And another thing to notice here is the flow solver took only around 5% of the optimization in the original approach, but it has improved to around 60% in the new approach, which is again an important improvement. So I would like to talk a little bit about the accomplishments of this project so far. We were able to accelerate the mesh optimization procedure from our original approach. A novel method was presented to remediate the opposing eigenmodes, which Hiro mentioned, and I didn't really talk about today, but if you have questions, I can explain a little bit more. We extended the application to three-dimensional problems paired with pseudo-transient continuation and CFL evolution strategies. We were able to use residual vector analysis to eliminate both the human decision aspect and the eigenanalysis. So automation. In our recent work, we have used principal component analysis on a selection of solution vectors for a better estimate of the solution modes. Okay, this part of the project I didn't really talk about today either, but it's in writing right now, so soon hopefully it's going to be published and you can go ahead and read it. So a little bit about my future plans. Right now I'm working on applying this method to anisotropic meshes, highly anisotropic. We're talking aspect ratios of 10 million and turbulent simulations, of course. But the tests show promising results, and hopefully it's going to work. The next goal is to perform dynamic modal decomposition on a collection of solution vectors for a more reliable estimate of the solution modes, because in our residual analysis and principal component analysis, we rely on the solution modes to show themselves in the solution, basically. So we wait for them to kind of start to blow up. but that might be too late for optimization. And we would like to have a prediction of what these modes are going to look like in the future iterations. So my understanding is dynamic modal decomposition is going to give us that better prediction of the eigenvalues and eigenmodes before they get to become too big, too large in the solution. I've also performed some tests on approximate eigenanalysis of the system where instead of using the full Jacobian for eigenanalysis, we just select certain rows. And this also showed promising results. Also, I would like to study and present novel guidelines for mesh generation. Overall, a number of new studies are going to be published soon and available to everyone, to interested individuals. So as my final slide, I would like to acknowledge the sponsorship of my supervisor, Professor Carl Oliver Gooch at the Advanced Numerical Simulation Laboratory at UBC. Also the funding from ANSYS Canada, as well as the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. And with that, I invite everyone, if they have any questions, to ask their questions.
Thank you, Mohammad. Okay, anybody has a question? Claire, Bill, go ahead.
Hi, this is Bill Klebb. Thanks for coming and giving us a talk and being the first remote experiment. And sorry to hear you're got a little problem with the voice there. I was interested in your last future work where the grid generation, mesh generation guidelines. I mean, this work has always scared me because you show me meshes and then you show me you just move one point just a little bit and it makes all the difference in the world. But I mean, both meshes look, you know, to the eye anyway, perfectly fine, you know, nothing obvious. So is there no hope for good looking meshes, I guess is what I'm asking. Does it all have to come down to mathematics and the stability of them?
Yeah, you're right. Actually, the first tests that I performed in my project was to show that a good looking mesh doesn't always give us stability. So I didn't have that particular test in my presentation today, but no, a good looking mesh doesn't always guarantee stability. And the novel guidelines, so one experiment that we performed was with the Jacobian diagonal itself and the off-diagonal values, of course. So if you remember Grishgorian circle theorem, which relates to the eigenvalues, if we make the diagonal of the Jacobian as small as possible, as negative as possible, so that's the diagonal dominancy, but if they're negative, they push those Grishgorian circles to the left side of the spectrum. It doesn't guarantee that all the eigenvalues are going to go to the left side, but it's a step in the right direction. So we basically try to formulate changes in the Jacobian to make the diagonal more negative and off diagonal smaller to make the circle shrink. And you know, you can do this with reconstruction stencil, with mesh, with the shape of the cells. Also, another thing that affects the diagonal of the Jacobian is the time step itself. When the problem is unstable, we usually take the time step, we make the time step smaller, and that actually pushes those circles to the left side. But it's possible that we change the mesh and we get the same result. But yeah, that's also, I think, an interesting aspect of the project, which hopefully I will have time to do, but we're gonna see.
Anybody else? question E. Maybe you can come up here.
So, does this method can apply to the other types of mixed element match, like the prism cells and the hex cells, besides the trapezoidal results you show in the paper?
Yeah, so in 3D applications or different types of cells, it also works. Right now, I take every mesh that I have already in our solver, and I don't really care about what the cells look like, but I have been focusing on rectangular cells recently, and it's the same idea basically. You just find vertices, gradients, and modify the mesh. And again, if they're like perfect rectangles, I guess the rectangles can have high aspect ratios, but even if they're like close to square, that also, I want to say, doesn't guarantee stability, but
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hero, I think you're muted.
yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so when I look at your residual iterative convergence plot, and on the right you showed a grid with a little movement of one vertex. Maybe I'm still trying to understand your method, but I thought you were doing this optimization after every iteration. So you have your mesh is changing as you iterate. Is it correct, or it's just one little movement for all iterations?
Yeah, it's not at every iteration for our original approach. Let me go here. I try to show this in a better way, but I guess this is what I came up with. So there's a certain nonlinear iteration that the user decides to perform the optimization. Usually a single optimization iteration, so this block on the right side, is enough. And we don't recommend doing this at the first iteration of the solver because there are unstable modes that just die out on their own. They're due to the initial conditions. And when the flow doesn't really look like the final result that we have. So that will be extra work, so we don't recommend doing that.
So you try to solve the problem and the iteration diverges, and then you try to do optimization and then change the mesh a little bit and then try to solve again, and it will converge next time.
Yes, usually that's the case in most cases. And we don't have to wait for the problem to diverge. We can just perform eigenanalysis, or other methods are cheaper computationally, and decide if the problem is unstable or not and perform the optimization. So predict, basically.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? I think we still have 7 minutes to noon.
So Bill Kleb again. I was just going to follow on my original question. So you said novel mesh generation sort of guidelines or something. I mean, to me, this is saying that you need to know your discretization in order to do your mesh generation. Are you suggesting that there may be some surrogate sort of discretization notions you could use that would give you better guidelines for mesh generation without having to couple it with a solver?
Yeah, that's correct. So the discretization is important. Many factors affect the stability. Actually, on the same mesh, you can have two different physics. One of them is stable and one of them is unstable. Okay, you can have different discretization schemes or reconstruction stencil, and that affects affects stability, boundary conditions, and other properties as well. But we think it's possible to do it, to do better meshes without knowing the physics. But I personally think we should know the physics beforehand when we do the optimization for better stability. Okay, but it's possible. It's possible to do without knowing the physics.
Yeah, there's some things that we can sort of sound. This isn't true for every problem in the world, but for convection-dominated problems, there are things that sort of flow through from the reconstruction into the Jacobian matrix, and you can make choices there that affect diagonal dominance, which in turn at least helps with pushing eigenvalues in the direction you want them in advance. You got to be careful about that because direction of advection matters. And so, that's going to be an interesting interesting aspect of that, right? Can we make things at least Pareto optimal, right? Can we make things better from one direction without making them worse from another direction? I'm totally with you, Bill, on the notion of this being a little terrifying, right? There are things that you look at and you say, well, why would that be a problem? And it is. We often get asked, well, is there something strange about your discretization? And no, there really isn't. Sorry, it's a bog standard least squares second order scheme. So yeah, it's, I would say that our chances of 100% success a priori are pretty small. Our chances of making things better, I'm pretty optimistic about. So somewhere in there, we're going to have to generate a bunch of meshes and get some statistics on sort of the before treatment, after treatment likelihood of success, right? But there's some reason to think that we can make some progress without knowledge beyond there's a strong convection component to the problem.
Thank you very much, Carl. So as Carl mentioned, the diagonal dominancy of the Jacobian is very important, and it's possible to make the Jacobian at least more diagonally dominant for a hope of a better convergence rate or stability. But yeah, the Grishkorian circle theorem is very weak in that sense. It doesn't really give us a good approximation of where the eigenvalues are, because if you've ever drawn those circles for an actual problems, they're all over the place. They're not super helpful, super accurate, but at least it's in step in the right direction, pushing them to the left.
Thank you. Maybe one last question if anybody has one. Questions? Okay, thanks, Carl. Okay, so let's thank the speaker. Thank you, Mohammad, and thank you everyone for joining us. And this video will be uploaded at YouTube later.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to give a presentation today.
It worked well. Thank you so much. We have 25 people from online.
Yeah. Also, thank you, Carl, for always being a help.